what do you call it? We are proud to be here today in this Q&A session. My name about the film, by all means. My name is Abdul Qadir Ahmed. I'm a Somali filmmaker, but in the same time, South African citizen. And I knew Ramadan, what do you call it, Ramadan from 1987 in Burkina Faso, where we met. So, Ramadan Suleman, welcome.
Thank you, Abdul Qadir. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for reminding me what I forgot to say. But salam alaikum means the peace of God be upon you. It's a blessing and a greeting at the same time. Suleiman, we saw your beautiful film, and what we would like to know more is the process, how you came to make that film. If you can first explain to us.
Well, it all goes back to 2009, or I would say 2008, when at the time the African Union had commissioned Algeria to organize the second Pan-African cultural festival, of which Algeria had organized one in 1969. Why the 2009 was commissioned is because many African countries were celebrating their 50 years of independence.
Yeah, I'm trying to fix it. I don't know why it's still there.
The African Union felt that Africa needed to organize its own. And they were trying to avoid what happened in 1965, when Senegal had organized the Pan-Af, the festival in Senegal in terms of the arts or Negro arts. And what the African Union found out, the OAU at the time found out, was that it was financed by the colonial powers. And yet Africa was celebrating the African arts, and yet the finance came from the former colonial powers. So the 2009 festival was in celebration of 50 years of the continent's independence. And it's in that first year, 69, there were about 32 countries. And in 2009, there were at least about 44 countries who participated. And Algeria used that opportunity to create something that will celebrate the continent outside of culture, but what else historically that could bring the continent together. And I was then called by the Algerian Ministry of Culture and commissioned through my company, Natives at Large, to look into the history of the liberation movement or movements in the continent, a history that is, in my view, and I'm sure many people who have watched the film would agree with me, it's an unknown story. It's an unknown history. And Algeria was well placed because of, as all of you have seen in the movie, what Algeria did in partly financing and assisting many liberation movements in the continent. I mean, there was a ministry in Algeria in charge of liberation movements, and liberation movements in Algeria at the time were not treated as officers. They were representatives and or ambassadors of their countries. So that is the context of how I was commissioned to do this documentary. I should say that it took 10 years to make, because the condition was I was not to go to the colonial countries or the former colonial countries and seek funding. For the Algerians, it was high time that Africans themselves paid for their own history. And that, for me, unfortunately, is where the difficulty arose, because Algeria had put together a budget, and they had also gave me access to at least 7 hours of archives. It was amazing, the amount of material on the continent that was made available, and for me, it was the first time to encounter an African country that had its archived so organized. For me, I mean, you would just ask for material, any material that was available. There's basically a catalog, and within that 15 minutes, you would receive whatever you asked for. So it was that simple. It took so long because, unfortunately, South Africa did not come on board as at the time. It took South Africa at least 10 years to respond to this project. But at the same time, I remember vividly, and I was there when the National Film and Video Foundation had actually signed an MOU, because this was supposed to have been a first co-production between South Africa and Algeria. On the Algerian side, it was interesting to learn that they automatically have a co-production with every African country. They do not require any documentation that says that the two countries agree. Algeria has a policy that says whoever comes from any African country is automatically a co-production, and it is official. So unfortunately, with us, with South Africa, we were still insisting on officializing the whole process. Hence, it took so long.
Appreciated that brief introduction of history. But it's very interesting that there is an African wisdom that says that we will conserve only what we love. And we will love only what we understand. And we understand only what we are taught. So our history and the new millennium of the new Coca-Cola generation of Africans, or chips generation, or millennial generation, what I used to call it. For them, it doesn't make sense at all, or doesn't have a meaning, or the struggle and the difficulty and that went through the so-called liberation. And worst of all, today, it seems that we are more colonized than yesterday. How do you think that that film will have an impact on the coming generation? Is a starting point or a question mark? Where do you think it will fit your film?
Well, for me, it would be unfair to, you see, all of us, when we went to school, you and I and millions of people in the continent, for that matter, did not choose what history lessons they want. It's always our leaders who determine what should be taught. So for me, the buck lies not with the young generation. The buck lies with our leaders in the continent not having the willingness, the political willingness to educate ourselves, our children, even those before us, in terms of our history. We all know that. We all know America, even if we have not been there. But we can tell you of monuments in America, in which city those monuments are found, and which bridges are where, and so forth. And yet, but it's because America is good at telling its history. But in terms of Africa, it's also incumbent on us to tell those histories. So for me, it was an opportunity for me to say, I'm taking the opportunity because it is also to enrich myself as the filmmaker, because there's a lot of history of the continent that I don't know. And it was for me an educational process, very rewarding. And I hope the current and the future will at least have a beginning on something to say, oh, there is this material that tells or talks to our history, and how can it is now for them to use this material going forward. I call this a start.
There is a question that came here that says, and I think that is a young person who asked this. I'm curious about the lack of female representative in the film. Can you talk about a little bit about it? Miriam Makeba is not a female, according to the film, but he says there is a lack of female here.
Very good point. Very good point. The issue of women representation in our history in the continent goes back to, I think it was in the 40s, when the first writers' meeting was held in Paris. And I remember Richard Wright, the American author, had actually made a comment about the absence of women in the writers' creative world at the time. And it is true that when I was looking at the archives, there was an absence. Women are there, but they are soldiers, but not necessarily as leaders. And it is true that across the continent, there was this lack of female representations within the liberation movements. And in trying to respond to this lack of female leaders, my discovery on the one hand of Miriam Makeba in the Algerian archives prompted me to bring her in as a liberation icon voice on her own. And that is how she, in terms of the structure of the film, we used Miriam, which is true. I mean, the history of Miriam in the continent is amazing. She was a liberation icon in the continent, and it is true that, I mean, as Judy Nordin, the former ambassador of the AU or OAU, does say that wherever she went, South Africa has always been her subject matter in terms of her songs. Having said that, it is also true that Miriam as a liberation icon, and I couldn't find the visuals and I couldn't find the recording. With the formation of the OAU in 1963, Miriam Makeba was the only, at the time, female diva icon who was invited to the opening and formation of the OAU, and she sang in one of the Ethiopian languages, right? Okay. But Miriam has been singing in many, many languages across the continent. Of course, we know of Malaika, but in Algeria, for example, she sang many songs. I mean, some of the voices that you hear, a voice singing in there, it's Miriam Makeba. I mean, her famous song, Abdul Qadir, you can correct me, Anahurra Al-Jazair.
Yes,
it's her who sings that.
Ramadan, to come back to you, you see, there is a concept, very important concept, that the artist is the keeper of the history of its own people. And he speaks the unspeakable and says the unsayable. And within that, there is to correct one point that you said before, the important meeting that happened was in 1957, the conference of black, what they call it, Negro writers, what they call it at that time, in Paris, where the beginning of the Cold War started and the division of the African who were on the process of struggle to divide between Eastern Bloc and Western Bloc. And that is where originated the group that in your film you mentioned, the Casablanca group and the Monrovia group, were the two groups that they split, one of the West and one is the East. And South Africa had an important role in that regard. In that moment, among the African writers and artists and sculptors, Ernest Mankoba was there, South African artist and sculptor, which is not recognized by South Africa, but is recognized internationally. And the other one, which was a famous Senegalese writer and philosopher, which is named after the university, which they even rejected his thesis in 1947, 50s, and they gave it him in the 1960s, his PhD. It was there also, Sheikh Anta Diop. And so, but that is the division where it came. In 1966, the Senegal Art and Council with the film festival, first Negro Festival, it was financed by the CIA and all these things, and the United States of America, and all these things where they brought a lot of people. And then it was in 1977 in Festac that happened, the second Negro Festival in Nigeria, in Festac. And then the other third group. But when it comes to the question of the women's that were present at that time in the creation of the AU, there is a famous, what do you call it, Algerian lady who was a member of the chairman of a cell called Jamila, which they nicknamed her Jamila al-Jazair, which they made famous films about that, who were tortured up to the level that they cut her breasts out, both breasts. And they made famous films about the Egyptian. They made a film about her, what do you call it? Algeria is a member of honor, and she was there at the liberation movement. Sarah Maldaror was there, the Martinican filmmaker. So there were a lot of, what do you call it? And she made a famous film called Zambin Saga. There were a lot of female presence there. But what the question that came secondly is that, what are the difference or similarities between these great freedom fighters that we see in the film and today young innovative activists? Can you tell the difference?
Well, the struggle in the 50s, 60s was a struggle with arms. The movie talks about the liberation of Africa. At the time, it was using arms. And parallel to that, you had the Miriam Makebas, who were the artists, not necessarily carrying a Kalashnikov. It is a good question. What has changed? What is the difference? And given where the Africa that we find ourselves in, and Chisano, the former president of Mozambique, alludes to it, to say, yes, have we achieved economic independence? We might have political independence up to a point, but the question is, what has changed? Have we? Some countries we are democratic, but given the poverty that we all live in today, that we see around us, has it changed in terms of the freedom that many people sacrificed and died for? Where we are in terms of our countries politically, economically, what has changed for the youth? It's not much. I mean, our youth at universities in South Africa about 2 years ago or 3 years ago, they were actually fighting for the syllabus at universities or schools to be changed. That was decolonizing syllabus. So it's a good question. Not much has changed. Another issue is 3-4 days ago, we had a coup d'etat in Mali, isn't it? Again, where is Africa in terms of economics, politics? Look at Zimbabwe. Unfortunately, Maputo is going through, Mozambique is going through a crisis in the north. So our youth in South Africa are, there's about 300, it's about 300,000 or more unemployed. So what has changed? It's a good question. Not much. As a parent, I can allude to that.
Well, yes, I understand. You see, there is a different type of independence. We have the national independence is one thing. Political independence is dubious. Africa is not politically independent. Worst of all, Africa is not culturally independent. Africa cannot teach their own history, although UNESCO approved that document and they made a research to have books about the history of Africa. And the funny thing is that all the head of states endorsed that history to be taught at the university and schools, in that de facto none one single African country implemented that decision. And we have a lot of things that approve it at the level of head of states, but never ever improve it. And we cannot talk about what do you call it, political, economical. So Africa is still a colony, but the difference is that yesterday they used to have a chains, today they are in debt. And the funny thing is this, that Africa sustains Europe. All the resources comes from Africa. Europe cannot let Africa go. Why? If they let Africa go, where they get their lifestyle and everything, being resources, being economy, being energy, being everything. You're the same United States of America. So today, the struggle of today is much more deeper and profound than the struggle of yesterday to obtain independence. So now today we have to obtain political independence, economic independence, and everything, and educational independence that we are talking about. So all of that, the struggle goes on. And which way forward, it will be the question. If we don't know even our own history, we have to reinvent ourselves. So that is the important role of any filmmaker, to decolonize the mind, what we call it about, but not in a liberal manner, but in a profound manner of the decolonization. And it's not an easy task. So how do you see those things as a filmmaker?
It is the role of the filmmaker to go out there and dig and dig and dig, so that to provoke society into looking at itself, provoking society to ask questions. And it is also the role of the filmmaker to guide that society into a particular journey. But of course, not all, when we say the role of the filmmaker, we have to be careful as well, because it depends on what kind of a filmmaker. And you know, if we are looking at a filmmaker in a social context, like I mean, I would narrow it down to an African filmmaker or Latin American filmmaker or certain parts of Asia. So again, the role of the filmmaker in society is to entice that society to find itself, to find an identity, right? And it's what Sembene always spoke about, Osman Sembene, to say that a filmmaker's role is to create the dialogue between the audience's mind and what is onto the screen. When you have that dialogue, then somehow, somewhere, the filmmaker has achieved something, because you do need that audience to go out there and find answers to the questions that, or the dialogue that's been provoked between him or her and the screen. And in so doing, somehow, somewhere, the filmmaker would have achieved its goal in making the audience look for answers in society.
It's a very profound thought that you had, but you see, in 1966 or 70s, when the Pan-African Federation of Filmmakers was created, is the only federation that exists in the continent which deals with the filmmakers of Africa. And one of the major objectives of that organization, written in its own constitution, is the role of the filmmaker to decolonize its own people. the decolonization concept. And it's not an easy task that today, more we become entrenched and into the world of debt, political crisis, coup d'etat, and all these things. In 1994, that clause in the African film, Pan-African Federation filmmaker, that clause has been erased. I witnessed that, the role of decolonization. And it's not an easy task. And why it's a very important, why whoever owns the cinema owns the cinema means distribution, owns the cinema and owns the production. And that comes to very important question that I have to you. You mentioned that Algeria considers every African country who submits a co-production with them, they are welcomed. But in South Africa, I know that they have a co-production deal with all Western and American. And I remember one of the chairman of that organization a long time ago, he made a statement saying that he goes to Canada in order to seek African experience and to go to London to look for African experience. Isn't that funny? And now you made a film with a Kwere African country, and you said that there was a memorandum of understanding. It took 10 years. How do you explain that thing?
Well, it's because, well, it all boils down to lack of political will and lack of recognizing your history. I mean, Miriam Makeba has always said that South Africa should be thankful to many of the African countries who played a role in where South Africa is at the moment. And unfortunately, we South Africans are in the dark of what did the African countries do for South Africa. We are in the dark. And it's because that information is not made available to South Africans. But when I talk about the political will of creating partnerships with African countries, it is so sad that we are all waiting for the African Union agreement that was signed in Rwanda. I think it was last year, where everybody is talking about the free trade. And it is sad because why did South Africa not 10 years ago, 15 years ago, look at those kinds of programs? We like to do things which in diplomatic circles is called bilateral agreements. And Algeria is saying, we don't need bilateral agreements. When you knock at the door, I open the door and I say to you, come to my house. Do we need an agreement for you to come into my house? No. So for me, it is all those kinds of politics that unfortunately we were not in the forefront as a country. We did not initiate these kinds of agreements. It was there, I suppose, in the days of Thabo Mbeki, who initiated quite a few things. Unfortunately, none of these things were followed up. I mean, I will use an example of the program in Timbuktu, where South Africa played a role in that museum. But yeah, till today, unfortunately, we do not have these agreements. I had initiated the co-production agreement with between South Africa and Algeria again 10 years ago. And I remember the Algerians saying to me, "Why do you need a document?" I said, "But my country wants a document." They said, "No, when you come to us with a project, we will assist you. You automatically become a partner. We don't need a document from your country that says we are friends." So I am still waiting for the authorities in my country to tell me why. I cannot answer you as to why. 22 years later, we do not have agreements with any African country. I do know that there's been proposals which were submitted. Algeria, which I know of, there was one with Kenya, there was one with Nigeria, there was one with Namibia, and I think Tanzania, But yeah, we still don't understand why this lack of willingness to do that.
Is integral part of the self-hate, we can call it, or Afrophobia?
Go on.
I'm asking you, is that the symptoms of the Afrophobia, undeclared symptom of the Afrophobia? The people call xenophobia, but it's not xenophobia. Why? No Chinese is attacked, no Irish or Swedish or Italian is attacked, but only Africans. That is the reason why I call it Afrophobia. Is it symptoms of the Afrophobia, cultural symptoms of the Afrophobia?
No. For me, it's a two-pronged argument. You have the state. That, in my view, as I said earlier on, has failed educationally, culturally, in making people aware of their identity vis-a-vis the identity of the continent. When the state has failed with that, you can't then blame the people. The people don't know. The people don't know. The people are dealing with issues of poverty, issues of hunger. So for me, it's not just a one answer issue of saying self-hatred. It's the issue of hunger. But what we are discussing here is another level of a discussion where you are dealing with, for me, it's a complete lack of willingness, whether is it political, cultural, on all levels. Had this been done at schools, had this been done where it is visible, right? If this was visible, the people out there who are living in poverty every day, and of course, in that poverty environment, you also have those opportunists as well, and which I would regard as thugs, who are very quick in pouncing on the weak. So I wouldn't allude to the issue of self-hate when it comes to the authorities. It's just that you I always talk about South Africa not having a political school that makes civil servants understand what it means to be patriotic, what it means for you to have a relationship with your neighbor, be it Mozambique, be it Botswana, be it Zimbabwe, be it Nigeria, Kenya, Somalia. Our civil servants have no understanding of what it means in terms of relationships between South Africa and those countries. How can it go beyond it just being diplomatic relationships? But and because you don't have that on all sides, well, I would say on the African continent, they seem to know more about the history of South Africa than the South Africans themselves, not knowing enough about their own history. And talking about the history of the African continent is it's like asking them to go to the Timbuktu desert, you know. So for me, it's quite complex, but the buck stays with our authorities. I can't blame the man on the street or the woman in the street for behaving in the manner they behave. It's because they don't know.
You see, Ramadan, it's easy to create a dichotomy between the man in the street and the man in power. The man in power comes from the man in the street. So there is no distinction in it. He wears only the collar of the authority, but he comes from there and he goes back to that society. So it's the whole society at all. And as an artist, we fail it, our community. We fail it, our society, not only South African, but all over the continent. That crisis is today, and it's getting worse by the day. And it comes back to the question that is not only South Africa now today, we are seeing this notion of self-hate, of being an African, that even now our young, beautiful girls, they're bleaching themselves to look more white. We know about more European cultural values and all these things. We consider there was a famous Somali poet. Somalis, you know that they're famous in poetry, that he settled in America, and he was famous in the Somali language, in the Somali-speaking world. That when he went to America, his son became aware of the American culture, and he said, "Daddy, did we have someone in Somalia famous like Michael Jackson?" Without knowing that his father was an icon. So today we are dealing with that. So we think about that, and we think about our teams, our players. They play in all the European teams, but we don't cherish and follow the games, African games, but we follow European or England games or Spanish games and all this. It's the self-hate that comes to it. We cannot have a space for our own cinemas. The distribution of our films is owned by Hollywood, and the money generated in Africa finances films from America or Europe, but not from Africa. So the self-hate is various, man, and it has a different connotation, different aspects. So it's not an easy task. Don't you think so?
Well, it's not an easy task. I mean, what happened in the 70s, the things that you are alluding to, has not changed today, in my view. When you talk about bleaching of one's skin, South Africa was a specialist of that in the 70s, 80s. We had that in South Africa. Zaire, you know that what has happened in Zaire. with the supper movement. All right, but again, the buck for me stops with our representatives who are put in power and who forget where they come from, and think that by having relationships with the West, they'll be better off than their own people, right? So for me, the issue at the end of the day lies there. I mean, we can talk about the corruption in the continent, where the very ones that you say, the man who came from the street and became powerful tomorrow has also forgotten that he came from wherever he came from. So it's the failure on the leadership. It's the failure on the leadership, not believing in itself, not expecting that the West use symbols from the cultural symbols from the continent, which are now being Beyonce is, for example, one of them who's using cultural idioms, icons from the continent in America, and yet why can't the leadership in the continent use the economic viability of these things? They don't seem to understand that, and unfortunately, the artists are left on their own, and that is why many artists are going overseas, like the footballers that you are talking about. It's because our politicians is all about their pockets. It's all about making sure that their bank accounts in Switzerland, in Paris, continue to receive money in those accounts, but it doesn't assist the people. The very same leaders are very good in going to Cuba to be treated for whatever ailments they have. We also have leaders who go to Singapore to be treated, who go to Paris, so this is the sadness of the continent, and the artist is left on their own. Whether is it writers, whether is it musicians, whether is it filmmakers, they have to find their own voice. So at the end of the day, for me,
I have a beautiful question for you that came, I think that it came from someone who's ready to jump on the wagon of the production. He says, please talk about the rise of popularity of documentary based on the high views on Netflix. As well as the powerful storytelling we see growing in the more and more docus. That is a beautiful term that I love, docus, being made and shown, and how we as an African need to ensure that we come on the party on that score. So someone who says, when you are going to join the party of the wagon of Netflix, what do you think about that? And he used the term.
Well, let me put it this way. We live in a country where documentaries are hardly shown on our broadcast. For example, take the public broadcasters. They do not show Come again?
Which broadcaster are we talking?
Well, we do have a public broadcaster in South Africa.
Okay,
whether it exists, whether it doesn't exist, the point is we do have officially. The point is they have never assisted or saw the need to put emphasis on documentaries that would be shown on their channel. And this has happened almost internationally. There's been this movement for the past 5 years where people were now saying, oh, documentary it's difficult to show it, it's difficult to find a platform. And I would say that Netflix saw a gap based on its American tradition of not accepting or recognizing that the world exists. And this has always been an American system. It's always been about themselves. And whatever that came from outside was never considered. And it was always about their material or stuff that would be shown outside of America. Now, the advent of Netflix, I would say, somehow brought about a certain democratization of us being able to watch stuff that we couldn't see before. Now, it is true, Netflix is able to say South Africa must make its own documentaries, or China can make, or India can make, Latin America can make. So I am able to watch the world in my home. Especially, I agree, whether is it series, whether is it movies, whether is it documentaries, we are able to watch. But unfortunately, for South Africans at the moment, it is the only platform, a possibility. But MultiChoice is not interested in documentaries. SABC that we spoke about, neither is ETV interested in documentaries. So that is unfortunately the hardship that documentary filmmakers are facing in South Africa.
Okay, but there is a fundamental question that I saw in is a kind of not kosher to speak in South Africa. It's not halal. And I haven't seen nobody even explaining or talking about what is a public broadcaster. What a public broadcaster should do in order to be a public broadcaster?
Well,
I can be a public broadcaster when it relies on advertisement. And if your product is not selling products, so indirectly, who serves that public broadcaster?
Well,
the interest of the advertiser or the interest of the public?
Well, unfortunately, the public broadcaster lost its mandate because the government per se did not see the need or understand the importance of the public broadcaster being independent or reliant on advertising revenue. This is the contradiction in South Africa, where you are expecting to create revenue from private sector by showing advertising on your channel, and you are able to gain whatever currency in order for you to fulfill the public broadcaster mandate, which is education, social education, but it cannot fulfill the mandate because of the contradiction. And normally, the public broadcaster should not be having advertising on its channel. It should be reliant solely on the tax system of the country. That, for me, is my understanding of a public broadcaster. But in South Africa, you have a contradiction which is now affecting the very public, which is unfortunately, it's almost 80% private, because 80% of its revenue is private. So the issue of it being public is contradictory.
That is not only public broadcasting, but also the film schools themselves. Why the film schools, they don't think about creating awareness on something worth valuable, but they will tell you, make films that brings bomb into the cinema. So already it's a commodity. They transform the cultural process in a commodity making process. So don't you see also that contradiction in the modern time today?
Well, I suppose when you live in an environment where, and this is the continent across the board, when the state does not understand the cultural role vis-a-vis its population, and it is solely reliant on the private sector. For me, that is the major problem. We have a Ministry of Culture in South Africa that for the past 22 years has not understood the economic value of the arts, whereby investment in the arts is one that should also help the artist, but also help the state itself. And they see the art as 100% NGO sector. In other words, they see whether is it film, whether is it music, whether is it got to do with the writers or the poets, across the board, they are seen as putting money into a sinking hole. But they themselves do not understand the value of the arts in terms of society that we all live in. So for me, these are the contradictions that you have as a ministry involved in the arts, but not understanding full well the role it plays in society. So for me, it is a huge problem that we are faced with, but it's across the continent, and that was partly the downfall that caused the downfall of African cinema in the continent.
You see,
it's because the filmmakers were also reliant on the former colonial powers for budgets in order for them to make their films, but nothing in their home countries was made possible for them to be able. I mean, Sembene Osman, even Medhondo always spoke about, it's easy to have your film shown in Paris than having your film shown in Senegal or Mali or in Burkina Faso. Those are the contradictions.
You see, it's not a contradiction, Ramadan. It's a well-orchestrated political scheme and carried forward by our post-colonial, what do you call it, after independence rulers in Africa. The cultural industries, what do you call it, is not put in the picture. And that is the reason why the system of funding, or system of, not only the artistic expression, there is something very, very, very profound, a part of our history, a part of our way of living, a part of our relationship values. We cannot bring forward why whoever pays the piper calls the tune. And that is where we are starting to ask ourselves certain times. And that's the reason why we call ourselves that we are always hysterically pregnant, but we will never deliver. One question that comes into my mind is there a place for indigenous knowledge in South Africa cinema? Not only South African cinema, but also all over Africa, the cinema. There is no space for our indigenous knowledge. I don't know if you noticed that. And now there is a young man who asked me, and a young person, I think so, who says, why you choose a portraiture approach of what you call the icons to tell the story of the liberation of Africa? Why did you make the choice versus telling the story from a typical historical perspective, which I don't understand what he means by, or what he or she or it means when he says a typical historical perspective. What is the typical historical perspective? That's a classical confusion mind, I think so. But why you choose?
Well, given why I chose, it's because the images chose themselves. The archives were in front of me. I didn't have an alternative. You know, it's different when you are in an environment where you do have alternatives. The icons that if I understand the question, hopefully, is
I don't have my phone. Wait, let me see.
Miriam Makeba was part of the era. Ben Bella was part of the era. Cabral was part of the era. Chisano, President Chisano was part of the era. So how else do you choose those icons when you were dealing with people who were part of that period? I'm finding it very difficult to answer. Why do you chose those icons? They were there in the archives. I mean, they are the people who actually fought.
No, that is the new generation, or what I call the millennial point of view.
Well, we don't know that. We don't know that.
And don't have another approach or another point of view of telling the story from a young man in the street or how he sees the story. But don't make a monumental piece of evidence concrete. Give space for doubts. That is what I understood he meant about that. But I think that
I could have done something, maybe just interviewing academics only who could just talk about the past. But how best to do it when you have the role players?
But that's
who can give you
postmodernism doesn't have everything is fluid. You have to understand that it's a postmodernist thinking, but they don't want something that comes from that point to that point, a linear history. We are going to the end of Ramadan.
Yes, please, let's conclude.
We are having a good time. We had a good time, and I hope that we will have a good time in life. But what is your later testament, what do you call a testament to the millennials? What is your advice or suggestion for the millennials about their history, about Africa, about South Africa, proudly South African, and everything?
I think it would be unfair to only look at millennials only. I mean, my generation...
They are the future leaders. The millennials will be the future leaders. We are out.
Well, the future leaders have no excuse going forward, given that we live in the times of Google, we live in the times of Wikipedia, we live in the times of Facebook. So accessibility to information is there. It's much easier now, but it depends on what you're looking for and how you are looking for that material. they have no excuse to fail because the information that they are looking for is always available. And it's as I've just said, you just need to go to the right places, be very structured in what you are looking for, or else you will swim in the dark waters of the sea and never rise again. So for me, it's they don't have an excuse because I remember in the 70s, late 70s, we discovered the Amilcar Cabrals, we discovered the Fanons. Yeah, those books were available. How they came into South Africa, I don't know, but we had access to that knowledge. So for me, it's up to them to seek knowledge and better themselves. But I have no lessons to give.
Okay.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. And I thank the organizers of these encounters of the third kind. You remember there is a film, it calls Encounter, Close Encounter, science fiction. This is a new science fiction, Encounters of the Third Kind, of the festival organizer. I thank them for giving us this opportunity to lament and to reminisce our youth and everything about our history and to deal with the young generation about the way forward. And I would like to tell something which is very important. You mentioned about the sea. I see not only the dark sea, but the sea of ignorance. That they don't have to swim in that sea of ignorance, which is intentionally created. I appreciate that. I thank you, my dear brother. Have a lovely day.
You.
Thank you for everyone watching.
And thank you to all.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.